make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
And so I think that one of the ways to understand what's happening to Christianity is actually by looking at a controversy over a devil statue in the Iowa State Capitol. You have the Satanic Temple that set up this goat-headed god in there because multiple different religious traditions can have space to set that up. That created a lot of controversy for obvious reasons. But for me, what's interesting about it is the fact that the Satanic Temple isn't really worshiping self-consciously this goat god.
Well, hello, Faithful Politics listeners. And if you're joining us on YouTube, your watchers, thank you for being here with us. I'm Josh Bertram, your faithful host. And as always, I have our political host, Will Wright. Thanks for being here with us today, Will.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. And today we're discussing Losing Our Religion, a latest book by author Russell Moore. Moore is with us on the podcast today. He's a significant figure in contemporary American evangelicalism. He has had a diverse and influential career in religious and public life. He's notably served as the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest evangelical denominations in the United States. His tenure there was marked by strong commitment in applying biblical principles to social and ethical issues. Beyond his role at the ERLC, Moore has been a theology professor at an SBC seminary and a pastor at a local Southern Baptist affiliate congregation. He is currently the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and is known for his thoughtful engagement with culture and political issues, often addressing the intersections between faith, public policy, and society. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for coming on the show with us. Can we call you Russell?
Sure. And thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to talking to y'all.
We have really been looking forward to talking with you. You know, I got to say, before we jump into the book, Losing Our Religion, which I love the quote, and I love the double entendre of losing my religion on somebody and the losing my religion as we'll get into the other part in the book. But I got to ask, kind of give the audience a sense. We have a very diverse audience, atheists, spanning from atheists to very conservative, hardcore Christian. And we also have different faiths that meet with us and political spectrums that listen to the show. Kind of give them a sense of who you are and where you're at right now, and what brought you to writing a book about losing our religion.
Oh, well, that would take a long time.
You got to read the book to find that out.
Yeah, that would take a long time. The reason that I wrote the book is because of an experience I had as a 15-year-old when I went through this real spiritual crisis of wondering, is everything that I've been taught in the church, is this all just really politics or Southern culture or keeping people in line or something else? And I had to work through that for a long time as a 15-year-old. And so I tend to think a lot about people who are in that same situation. And so over the past several years, it seems to me that there are a lot of people in that situation, and justifiably so. And so I wanted to work through kind of what does it look like to live through crazy times like these, but not with losing your religion in the sense of tossing it aside. And so that's really the short version.
Nice.
Okay, so I want to address something up top that I'm seeing a lot of chatter about, specifically in the X/Twitter, some might say jitter space.
Sure.
but like, what's the deal with this Rob Reiner documentary? And,
Yeah, I mean, I have done probably, I don't even know how many interviews about this subject, and that's one of them. And I think it's an important issue for everybody.
because I noticed that there's a lot of like, I don't know, like a lot of detractors about Christian nationalism. I know Rob Reiner's coming out with this documentary about it, and I'm just seeing a lot of like, I don't know, hate on it. And I believe, like, don't correct me if I'm wrong, like, but you're interviewed as a part of the documentary.
Yes.
Yeah, and
which I think is an important thing to do, because we as Christians bear responsibility for our own witness. And the last thing that we should do is to say, well, people who hold traditionally orthodox views shouldn't engage with people who are concerned about some things that they have seen. That's essentially just conceding all of the ground, both to kind of the problems that we have within the church and to what that is projecting about Jesus to the outside world. So,
yeah. So as one that works for Christianity Today as an editor, specifically, can you give us sort of like a temperature check of Christianity in America today? I think that, there's a lot of stuff you see in the news, a lot of stuff you may read, but I'd love for you just to kind of give us a diagnosis, like a phrase that I used with Curtis Chain recently was like, he was a doctor of divinity, and I'd love for him to just, give us an assessment of where we are medically.
Yeah, I think what's happening right now is a realignment. And so I think everything is being shaken. I think that's true institutionally, even apart from the church. But I mean, every institution is in a huge time of flux, and the church is in the middle of flux, and also of a resorting. And so it's kind of like, I think the best analogy that I can think of would be the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 20s, leading up to the 1920s, where you had people who the categories changed from Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists to kind of uneasy, sometimes coalitions of people in all of those categories, but who believe the same things about foundational matters, and vice versa. And I think a similar thing is happening right now, and that's disorienting. And so I was just talking to a Christian yesterday who said, okay, well, what is going to happen? And I said, I don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, I know what's going to happen in the long term, but we don't know what's going to happen in the next decade. And I think that's intentional on God's part, because I see God doing that so often biblically, of putting people in a situation and putting the church specifically in a situation where you're kind of in that in-between place that forces real dependence on God. And, the pillar of fire leading the Israelites out of Egypt didn't have a predictable pattern and gave just enough light for the next leg of the journey. And I think we're in a similar moment right now, and that's fine. So
I love that. Yeah, sorry. I love the imagery that you just evoked of the Israelites having to listen. I was just reading that the other day in Numbers and thinking, man, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I really understood like how frustrating at times that must have been for them. Like sometimes it was a month Sometimes it was longer. Sometimes it was one day. And they had to do all that stuff and pack up and go because God said, all right, you've been here for a day. Let's go. And I can imagine being so frustrated. Again, we're leaving again. And yet that's how it seems like, right, God works. And we talk about this often on the show, the reality that like separation of church and state is a modern idea. And it really isn't like, I mean, we agree with it. We're all for religious freedom. We want that. We cherish those things. But this is not something new where the state co-opted religion or religion tried to co-opt the state to gain power. And you talk about that a lot in your book, Losing Our Religion, this sense of power and this sense of what have we done to get here? And I'd love if you can just kind of trace in broad strokes your argument from that book saying, hey, those of us who feel like political, political exiles, right? And religious, that's what I kind of feel like in the sense that I'm an orphan. I don't have a political party right now. It feels like, because neither of them represent who I am in Christ. Help us understand how we're here from where we were. Was it always this way? Is there anything different about now, or is something unique going on? What do you think?
I do think there's something unique going on, but I think that reality that you're talking about with a sense of homelessness in that sense is in fact where we started as a church and where at our best moments we've always been. You had the question throughout all of the Gospels is which group is Jesus going to assimilate into? And so when that question is asked, where Jesus says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, we sometimes forget what the context of that was. And it was a trap for Jesus in order to fit him into one of the pre-existing categories. So if Jesus were to say, pay your taxes, he would be saying, it's fine that the throne of David is occupied, surrender to Roman rule, and would have sided with the collaborators. If he had said, don't pay your taxes, he would have been saying, revolt against Roman rule and siding with the zealots. And instead, Jesus just reorients the entire question. And he does that over and over again. So I think that is where God tends to bring his church. When it comes to what's different about right now, I think there are several things that are different, but one of the things is we're experiencing a different kind of secularization than the one we prepared for. I think there were a lot of people who prepared for a kind of secularization where they would be able to see people who are not believers out there, who have categories that are different. And so we need to be able to speak to them with a Christian worldview. I don't think what most people counted for is a secularization within the church that fills in pre-existing categories that feel orthodox with new content. And so you have, for instance, if you think about the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the prophecy movement, prophecy conferences, and prophecy novels, and last days sorts of teachings would really assemble a crowd. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that those things promised to tell you what was really going on. This is what's really happening with Gorbachev, or what's really happening with Saddam Hussein, or whatever. And also gave you a sense of you're right at the precipice of the final drama. It's all been leading up to this. We have the same thing going on now, but it's not filled in with people pouring through Ezekiel to figure out who Gog is. Instead, it's
Right.
a completely politicized or culturized sort of view of what that apocalyptic moment is, which is why you can get the idea of, well, desperate times call for desperate measures. So all the normal kinds of moral norms and expectations and commandments and so forth are out the door. And then you've got, and think about spiritual warfare, which became a really important category from the 1970s on in evangelical Christianity, rooted in a biblical emphasis, very biblical emphasis. That has been secularized, where you have those concepts of spiritual warfare, but they're projected toward one's political and cultural opponents, which is the exact opposite of what spiritual warfare was intended to teach, which is we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And so that what that ends up with is you replace demons with demonized people. But when you keep those same categories, I mean, for those of us who believe in demons and spirits, demons are not redeemable.
We're not trying to call them to the altar.
You're not calling them to the altar. And so that changes then the way that you see the people you're arguing against. So there are all of these factors, and then you add into it the huge disruption that that technology, especially social media, has brought. And I think Jonathan Haidt's work on this in terms of adolescence is completely on point. And a compelling case. You add all of that together, you end up with a moment like we have.
Man, that is powerful. You know, I was thinking a couple things. Even as you were talking, I remember a couple quotes from the book. One, that you can't turn Jesus, like you can't replace Jesus with Thor until you turn Jesus into Thor. And once you turn Jesus into Thor, this war god of wrath, right? Which is what they always wanted Yahweh to be. They wanted to be the Yahweh that could, you know, give them all of their imperial desires, like Assyria and like Babylon. And why do they get to have the empires and we have to stay within these borders that God has set for us? And yet we're doing it seems like the exact same thing now. And, you know, I'm a leader, a religious leader, right? Consider myself in that category. And I'm looking at what's happening today, and I feel like I don't even know what to do next. Sometimes I'm just like, is this really, pinch me? Is this happening? Am I dreaming? What's really going on here? What do you think leaders, how do we, especially thinking about this upcoming 2024 election, how can we navigate these dynamics, which the reality is the politics and religion are so intertwined in the hearts of our people, in the hearts of many, many Americans and people around the world. We can't separate them. How do we use this? How do we lead well and have integrity with the teachings of Jesus, and also figure out how to navigate this landscape that we're in right now?
Well, I don't think there's anything that we can do about the country, broadly speaking, or the church, broadly speaking. I think what we can do is to Romans 12, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's an ongoing process through the help of the Spirit, which means that you really can't control the context you're walking into in 2024, and we don't even know what that will be. I think there are a lot of people who are, you know, they're bracing for 2024, but it's because they think it's a replay of 2020. And you know, it's easy to see why they would think that, because you're dealing with the same cast of characters and so forth. But we may well be moving into something we cannot imagine, just as we couldn't imagine 2020. I mean, if we'd sat down here before Christmas in 2019 and said, how should we prepare for 2020? We would have known, oh man, another presidential election. We would not have known what was headed our way with COVID-19 and what that was going to do. So we don't actually even know what we're going into. What we can know is to break the power of some of that by not giving into it. And a lot of that has to do with being aware that it is there. I was just talking to somebody earlier today who had been in a really awful situation in a church. It was a completely unhealthy church structure, and she had to say some things about it. And I said, well, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have people who are going to start saying, well, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. You could have done it a different way. And then you're going to start second guessing yourself. And you're going to be feeling shame or guilt for leaving. I said, but if you just know that that's going to happen ahead of time, you can break the power of it because you recognize it. And I think the same thing is true for all of us, just sort of in the big picture writ large. If you know, okay, we're headed into some stormy times, and it's going to be uncomfortable. But then when that starts to happen, and you start to, our subconscious minds are able to talk us into things that will make our lives more comfortable. I mean, that's just simply the case. If you're aware of that, then it breaks the power of it.
Wow. So I consume probably an unhealthy amount of news, primarily in the political arena. I mean, I do follow sort of like the Christian nationalism news, but one thing that caught my eye, this is several years ago, was an article that came across. It was either the Atlantic or Washington Post, but it announced your departure from the SBC. And I know this happened a couple years ago. We didn't get a chance to talk to you a couple years ago, so now's my chance to ask you. But I'd love to kind of get your take on, or maybe your take's the wrong word. Explain kind of why you left the SBC. I mean, and for context, like, people leaving churches and kind of, in a big way, or just leaving them in general, has always kind of struck me a little bit odd, because I didn't grow up in the faith. I came to the faith much, much later in life, 2008. So, even by, I don't know, just religious standards, you could probably still call me a baby Christian. I came to Christ in 2008. But it seemed like it was pretty significant. So I'd love for you to maybe just talk about that time period. What sort of led you to leave the SBC? And maybe what are some of the broader implications, maybe for the country?
Well, I think that part of the problem is most of the world doesn't, nor should they, understand kind of the way that the SBC works, the way that our polity works. But you can't leave the SBC really, because you never really were in it, because each congregation is autonomous. So you're part of a church. And so in that sense, I mean, I joined a church that's multi-denominational. I still am a Baptist, still think of myself as a Baptist. But the reason why I left the system that was there is because I had I had thought for many, many years, I can change, I can help change some of the bad things here while conserving the good things here. And there are a lot of good things there, and a lot of good people. And I came to the point where I concluded I'm not going to be able to do that. And the reason I'm not going to be able to do that is not because of the quote unquote, and I'm saying this ironically, not literally, but the bad guys, not because of the bad guys, but because the good guys, quote unquote, don't really understand the psychology of what's going on. And since then, I've seen that happen in congregation after congregation after congregation, because you have the same sort of cycle that goes on, and every pastor who's going through it thinks I'm the only one that's facing this, so I must have done something wrong. But it's the same sort of pattern where you have these, as Amanda Ripley calls them, conflict entrepreneurs, for whom the issue is not one particular controversy. It's moving from controversy to controversy to controversy for the sake of the controversy. And often that's not rooted in something bad. It's rooted in people who want to feel like they have conviction, and they see that as being identifying who the heretics are and fighting them. And sometimes that's what we're called to do as Christians, is to fight the heretics. That's Athanasius did that. Martin Luther did that. Many times in the history of the church where that's the thing one is called to do. But if one identifies that and that alone with standing for Christ, then it creates a very, you have to then have an ongoing sort of controversy to get there. And a lot of, you'll have in a church, there will be a tiny group of people, sometimes 5% of the congregation. But the problem is that the 95% of the congregation will often think, well, I mean, if we just kind of give them 30% of what they want, then they'll get on board with the mission and we'll go forward. And when that doesn't happen, I mean, what the goal is, and I said this to a pastor who was going through this the other day, the goal is not to assemble a lot of opponents against you. The goal is to just keep hitting you until you either self-censor and stop doing whatever it is that they don't want you to do, or being who it is they don't want you to be, or, and more likely and more usually this is the case, to wear down and exhaust that 95% of the congregation, so that they start saying, why is the pastor always in controversy? So it's kind of the effect of, I was seeing online the other day, somebody said that they do as a party trick. And it sounds kind of sadistic to me, but so they walk up to people and say, I want you to know that I personally don't have a problem with your being here.
Awkward.
Well, that is literally true, but it creates a very different reality, because when you say that,
that's
the
amazing.
person's sitting there thinking, well, apparently nobody else wants me to be here. And that's what can happen in a religious institution. And so I think that when it comes to this question of do I stay or do I leave, I mean, there are a couple dangers there that one has to take into account. In the leaving, there's the danger of leaving too soon, and having a situation that you really can be part of the solution of, if you don't quit and you just don't give up. And that was the mode I was in for a very, very long time.
Makes sense.
but there's also the danger on the of the staying. The danger is you become complicit in that, in whatever the structure is, and it starts to change you. So I don't, in any sort of unhealthy religious institutional structure, I don't judge the people who leave. I don't judge the people who stay, because I've done both. And I think that in different contexts, each of them are the right thing to do. And a lot of times it's a hard thing to figure out where one is in that context.
Yeah. I'm curious just more about your experience, because I don't know if I'll ever get to a point in my life where I'm considered a public figure per se. I mean, maybe like I am a public figure because I'm part of the public and I'm a figure, but like, nobody knows Will Wright, Josh Bertram, but they know who you are. And like, how did, like, when all these news organizations are writing stories kind of about your departure, like, was there a point kind of in your journey where you're like, I did not realize this was going to be as big of a deal as it was? And I'm curious, did you have any reservations about whether or not it was the right choice for you, your family, what have you?
I had reservations because I was the last person in my family to get to this point, and a lot of that had to do with I have been for all of my life really embedded culturally in Southern Baptist life at every level, and institutionally and so forth. So it's kind of, to be in a non-SBC context is sort of can feel like kind of undoing Vacation Bible School or something. Everything that you were trained for in terms of that. But when it comes to the issue of like news and that sort of thing, the answer to that for me is I didn't read any of those things. So I still haven't. I read Tim Alberta's book that includes a lot of my story, and that was actually about the first thing I have read about anything related to that. And I
like that strategy.
Well, it's not right for everybody, but it's right for me, because I know, there are some people, and I have friends for whom, that kind of thing would just get their blood pumping and motivate them to press forward. It doesn't do that for me. So I know it's better for me not to do that. So when I read the Tim Alberta book, I put it down and said to my wife, wow, that was a lot in a short period of time. And she said, yeah, we all know.
It's like, we know, Russell.
We know.
Now, was this the American Carnage book or the Kingdom, Power, and the Glory book?
This was the Kingdom, Power, and the Glory. This was just the other day. Yeah.
Dude, that's amazing. I feel a sense of, honestly, camaraderie with you, Russell. And the reason is not, there's a lot of reasons. I can't actually think of a reason it wouldn't be, but the big reason it was is because I actually left the denomination I was in. Now, in this denomination, they issued your credentials. And so I decided to let my credentials lapse. And honestly, thinking about it, I didn't realize at the time, but even in this particular, and I just want to be careful because I have so many friends, right? And so many people, and I don't want to ostracize anyone unintentionally. You mentioned that in your book, like, why offend people just to offend people, right? There's no purpose in that. But I just kind of got this sense, man, I don't belong, even though I do. and I'm gonna like have to do some things that they're not gonna like. For instance, having a podcast that has that we've had transgender bishops on to the podcast to talk to them, and we've talked to people that have really, including yourself, sounding the alarm for Christian nationalism, and there's a lot of people that don't like that. They don't
like
and
even
this
the
is
conversation.
yeah, they don't even want the conversation because it's too uncomfortable. So I'll give you just two quick scenarios, and I'd love to get your response because I think they're indicative of where a lot of people probably are that are sitting in the pews. And this is just an intuition I have. But the first is from a good buddy, and we're talking about the ideas of Christian nationalism, and he's like, "Well, Christian, I'm Christian. I think Christian's a good thing. Nationalism, I'm a patriot. What's wrong with Christian nationalism?" So that's one, right? And then there's another where I was actually at a seminary environment, and I was talking to someone, and I raised the question because we were talking about some issues that people were having and stuff like that with their denominations. And I raised my hand. I was like, I would like to say that the biggest thing I'm concerned about is Christian nationalism and how it's infecting the evangelical church. And I'm Pentecostal, and it's really getting the Pentecostals.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that sense of affinity, and they almost got me because I was very much like, if I hadn't had some key things happen, maybe I would have been there on January 6th. I don't know. But the reality is, though, there's a lot of people that are thinking, I'm patriotic, I'm Christian, this is a good thing. Like, look, Christian, like, we're going to treat people better than they're going to treat us. Oh yeah, that was the past. All that slavery stuff, that was back then. This is now. Let's move past that. And how the church has done all these terrible things and used the Bible for horrific, reasons. And let's just move past it. That's not Jesus. That's not us now. And with this idea that they couldn't be there, and I'm in this seminary environment, and a lady comes up to me afterwards, just the sweetest, most genuine lady, and the most genuine question. She's like, Christian nationalism, I mean, I meet with a group of ladies, and we pray, and we ask, for God to, basically, guide Congress and just different things like that. She's like, is that bad? And I'm like, that's not bad. But it was almost like this confusion to even what it is and why it's bad. And I'd love, from your perspective, to help kind of like bring the issue, like, hey guys, here's what's going on. Here's what you've seen, what you've experienced. Here's what's going on, maybe on a larger scale. And I think we need to pay attention to it because this is very much in opposition to the gospel of Christ and its purposes in America. And I'd love for you to help, even imagining talking to someone like my friend or someone like this sweet, genuine person at the seminary. What is your call to them, your clarion call? What would you like them to understand about this current issue?
Well, the first thing is the kind of really quick way to help people to see that first scenario that you're talking about, if I just have 30 seconds, is to say, I'm ethnically white and I'm a patriot. Am I a white nationalist? No. And if you can make that distinction, if you can understand the difference between being white, nothing wrong with that, loving your country, nothing wrong with that, and being a white nationalist, then you understand the difference between being a Christian
very good.
loving your country and being a Christian nationalist. And then what one has to do is to look at the broader what's going on in the world right now. And so I think that one of the ways to understand what's happening to Christianity is actually by looking at a controversy over a devil statue in the Iowa State Capitol. You have the Satanic Temple that set up this goat-headed god in there because multiple different religious traditions can have space to set that up. That created a lot of controversy for obvious reasons. But for me, what's interesting about it is the fact that the Satanic Temple isn't really worshiping self-consciously this goat god. They're atheists.
Yeah.
They don't, what they're attempting to do is to use that goat god to own their enemies. And the outrage is itself part of the point. But also because what they're ultimately trying to do is to undo having nativity scenes or Hanukkah menorahs or so forth in the state capitol. So it's a using of this this figure in order to get what they think is really important. Now, you look at that happening with that little wacko group, and then you look at what's happening with the way throughout history people have used Christianity as a means to an end. And that's what Christian nationalism is. It's a use of Christian symbols and images to get to an ethno-nationalist goal. And that what you end up doing with that is you end up in Satanism. And what I mean by that is not that you become a goat head idol worshiper. What I mean is that if you think about what Jesus says to Peter, when Peter says our enemies are, we're not going to hand you over to them. They're not going to win. And Jesus' response is, "Get back, Satan, because you're putting your mind not on the things of God, but on the things of man." And so you have Simon Peter, who unwittingly, in that moment, right after he had confessed Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, he had at that moment actually adopted the devil's way of seeing things. And that's ultimately what Christian nationalism does, is it exchanges new birth for a different understanding of how we come before God, which is culture by culture or nation by nation. And I mean, one of the best examples of Christian nationalism, I'm not saying that it applies to the person that this was written about, but there was somebody who said, talking about someone, and said he would rather live in a neighborhood of atheists with Christmas trees than in a neighborhood of Somali Christians. And I stepped back and said, that sums up a lot of where we are around the world, where Christianity is really standing in for Western civilization, or what it means to be German or French or Dutch or American. Then that's just not what Christianity is. And it's what so much of the New Testament is about knocking down.
Yeah. I love that. It's interesting. Will has a question. I'm going to throw it over to him here soon, but you're talking about the Satanic Temple, and we interviewed the co-founder of the Satanic Temple this week or last week. And I don't remember. And it's funny because I love what you said, because when I was talking to them, I'm like, man, I feel like I can have a much more reasonable conversation with this person than I can with many of the people I know that I love or have known over the years. And they share my beliefs. They would never put a goat statue in try to get that put up in the state capitol, but they're not reasonable. They're not open to hearing anything else. Go ahead.
Well, and the bigger issue there being the most dangerous ways that the devil gets at us are not through those kind of shockingly overt actions. I mean, you think of Screw Tape Letters. what the elder devil is saying to the younger is we actually do want to conceal ourselves. So if what you can do is to end up asking the same questions the devil asked in the temptations of Jesus and coming up with the answers the devil wants in the temptations of Jesus while thinking it's Jesus, that is the worst of all possible worlds. And that is exactly what I believe to be the very cunning nature of what's often going around us, and none of us are exempt from it. I mean, that's what we have to be constantly asking is, am I losing my sense of what the way is that I've been given, the way of Jesus, and how I get there? Because it's really easy to lose sight of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think probably the most frustrating thing for me, like I'm not nearly as smart about theology, Bible stuff as someone like yourself or even Josh, who's going to school to learn more about this stuff. And like we've spoken to so many theologians and just different people that just think differently. And, part of my struggle is like, how do I know if the things I'm thinking about or believe in are actually like doing Jesus justice? Because you've got Christian nationalism, you've got like the New Apostolic Reformation, you've got all these other different things. And, I've got a lot of Christian friends that I would be like, yeah, I don't think being gay is a sin. Then they're like, oh, but being gay is a sin. It says right here. And then I'm like, yeah, but we've spoken to other people much smarter than I am that says it's not. But we've also spoken to people that said it is, and I'm like, do I have to go like to divinity school to figure out where I stand on certain issues? So like, can you maybe help our listeners that might be listening? How do we discern if the Jesus we're following is the one that we're supposed to be following?
Well, if you think about the imagery that the New Testament uses is that of a voice. There's a voice calling you forward, shepherd with sheep. So one of the ways I think that you determine that, and this is going to sound really Southern Baptist Sunday schoolish, but it's because I think Southern Baptist Sunday School was right on this point, which is you need to immerse yourself in the scriptures, not to the point that you necessarily have memorized verses that you can go to, but by being in the scriptures enough that you start to recognize things. So, I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday for my show with David Brooks about the difference between what he calls paradigmatic thinking, which is propositions and data, and narrative thinking, which is the way you really get to know a person, is understanding the story of that person. And that includes the intellect, but it also includes affection. It includes imagination, it includes all of that. And I think if you're in the actual text of scripture enough that you start to hear yourself when you're saying the equivalent of, yeah, but who is my neighbor? And you start to recognize those things. I think that's a critical the first step to it. And then beyond that, I think what we have to always be looking at, it's not just that you need to know objectively who Jesus is as revealed in Scripture. You also need to, John Calvin, knowledge of God and knowledge of self, which means you need to know kind of where your own personal vulnerabilities are. So if you're and that tells you what you need to shore up. So if you're a naturally contrarian sort of person, that's going to bring with it one kind of question that you'll ask yourself when you're evaluating something. If you're a naturally conformist kind of person, that's going to answer the other. And I would say one way, there's not a short way to say, oh, let me see whether I'm right or wrong about everything. But one of the ways to try to evaluate that when it comes to a specific issue is to say, am I part of sort of the tribal unit that I'm in? Do I line up with that completely? And if you do, it might be because your tribal unit is inerrantly inspired. Or
maybe,
or more likely, it's because you are you're conforming yourself to that tribe. And so that's, I think that when it comes to the Bible, I mean, I think there are a lot of a lot of Christians who think, well, I have to understand everything that I'm reading, or else it's not benefiting me. And in that sense, they're bringing that paradigmatic sort of thinking. And what will happen is they'll get to Leviticus or Second Kings and say, I don't understand any of this. It doesn't apply to me. When in reality, what Jesus is doing by speaking to us through Scripture is giving us what we need before we need it. And so there are all kinds of things about simply hearing the voice of Jesus as revealed in Scripture that are going to prepare you for things that you're not thinking about right now, which is, honestly, those are the most dangerous things for us, both as individual persons and kind of broadly seen as societies. The most dangerous things are not the things we're arguing about at the moment. So things we're not arguing about at all, either because we've just become so accustomed to them that they're normalized, or because we're not getting prepared and we don't see them coming. So for instance, go back to, we're talking about that Jonathan Haidt study, go back to 2012 and say, what's the most important thing in terms of the education and mental health and development of our children? You would probably not say a piece of glass that can be put in somebody's pocket. Now you look back and we can see, oh, look at what this has done to us. But by this point, it's something that's ubiquitous. And so the response from people is, well, what are you going to do? You have to be able to get ahead of those things. And I think the way you do it is not by having sort of a list of issues with a list of answers. It's by being familiar with Christ, which means a certain kind of posture of mind, and it means an immersion in Scripture, which does not mean that you're going to get everything right. The apostles, half the time throughout the New Testament is about either Jesus or somebody else rebuking one of the apostles for saying something stupid. So if Simon Peter could do that, then certainly I can. So it doesn't do that, but it does give you the way to pursue that voice.
So just so I'm understanding, there's no magical BuzzFeed survey or Myers-Briggs test I can take that's like, do you believe Trump is King Cyrus? Check here, and then it'll tell me what sort of Christian I am.
Well, I think it's like anything else. Just think about your own life personally. There are some things that are really clear and evident. So, you don't really need to spend a lot of time agonizing over whether or not you should drive drunk. You're able to see that that's the case. Right. There are some other things where there are some broad principles, but we disagree on how we ought to pursue those broad principles. And then there are other things where we say, I don't know if I'm right or wrong about that. And sometimes in those cases, the best thing to do is to say, I don't know. But I mean, those categories are always going to be present. And you have to just know the difference. You have to know, at least to some degree, the difference between those three.
Yes. Man, that's really profound. When I'm like thinking about this next year, my preaching in this next year, you know, and I help some pastors with developing sermon preparation and things like that. So like, and even encouraging them and what might be a good direction to take this next year. You know, one of my things I'm wondering about is that we have grown up. When I grew up, everyone hit political issues in the pulpit. Typically, it was abortion. It was sexual purity, same-sex marriage, things like that. I mean, when I was growing up, I don't even think that was mentioned. When I was growing up, and the idea of same-sex marriage, I didn't even know that was a concept, honestly, until I was in college, that it was even like a concept people were talking about. And that shows a lot more about me and where I was than where it was actually happening within the world. Although I know that it was a newer phenomenon, for sure. But what the point I'm getting at is that when we're talking to people about preaching, it feels like we've got to preach on some of these issues, right, that hit, or we got to offer guidance on these issues, or else our people, I'm thinking about leaders and pastors, are people, who are they going to be discipled by? They might be discipled by Jordan Peterson, or they might be discipled by Ben Shapiro, or they might be discipled by, and really it's probably a combination of several different people, way more than Jesus. And they want to hear me preaching on issues that I feel like the Bible would speak to. I'm saying hypothetically, not my church necessarily, but would want to help me preach on issues that they feel like are important. And yet, how do we strike that balance? Because so many people, when I look at my nieces and nephews, and I'm the youngest of 5, and I'm not that much older than them, but the difference between how they think and how I think, it startles me, to be honest with you. It startles me that in such a short amount of time, they could think so radically differently. And I start thinking, how are we going to reach these precious souls that God has entrusted us to, that don't just think it's true because we say it, or even because the Bible says it? So what do we do going forward with hitting these issues? What have you found to be, as you've seen in other churches, what have you found to be effective, or what, even in your own experience, what do you recommend, even if it's just broad principles?
Well, there are going to be times when you're going to need to hit some issue that is emerging right in front of you right now, because that's what your people need to have some sense of how to process that, number one. But number two, because sometimes there are all kinds of other things attached to the questions that are being asked about whatever that issue is, that you can sort of even take that one issue and show people a bigger picture. But most of the time, I would say, you can't. But one of the things that a pastor will just wreck doing is to say, I've got to provide counter programming as exhaustive as Ben Shapiro and Rachel Maddow and
Candace Owens. Don't forget Candace Owens.
So you're from whatever point of view, politically or culturally, you can't do that. Number one, you don't have time to do it, but you also don't have authority to do it. So the authority that we've been given as preachers is to say, that guy, listen to what he's saying. And here's some of what it is. So again, you come back to what we just talked about. There are going to be some things that what you're speaking about are thus saith the Lord. Then there are going to be other things where what you're talking about are broad principles. I don't think that God at least has given us a policy paper on how many immigrants to let in through the southern border. What I do know is what God has told us to think about immigrants themselves. And so you can have Christians who might disagree on how the asylum process ought to be done better. Where that has to be hit is when you start dehumanizing those people. And when you start, using categories of invaders and rats and so forth. I mean, that there are biblical principles that then have to be applied. And then there are going to be other things where you don't have the authority to speak to them at all. You leave it to the conscience of the people. And sometimes you're going to make mistakes in terms of figuring out what those are. But the biggest point is this. A lot of people will say, how do I lead my people through 2024? And for the most part, I say you can't. Because what's happening in 2024 is not emerging suddenly in 2024. It's been building up for a long time, whatever it is, for good or for bad. What your task is more about, I mean, you've got to help your people get to 2025, but your primary task is helping them to be a certain kind of person in Christ in 2034. And that means that a lot of the things that you're going to be doing, it's not about equipping them with answers for specific issues, as much as it is giving them a framework to think about those things in the first place. And I mean, the same thing's true in terms of life. I mean, at every life stage, we need somebody saying to us, "Hey, when you go through puberty, you're going to think you're going crazy. You're not. This is normal. When you hit midlife, you're going to have this, and you need those steps. But sometimes those can be done so early that you don't, you can't benefit from it, or so late that you having the conversation about puberty to the 18-year-old is in most cases not going to help a lot. It's also not going to help to prepare the 2-year-old for puberty. So preaching is a lot like that, of helping ourselves through these different stages. And so just think about, I mean, what you're trying to do with, say, youth ministry is not really about teaching them how to live in high school, except to a small degree. What you're really trying to do is to teach them how to die in a nursing home. And every stage along there, because you're throwing the word out and letting the word do its work in a way that takes root. And you sometimes don't ever even see where that leads, because it happens after you're long gone. That's the way God's always worked. And I think I think there are a lot of people who put a lot of pressure on themselves because they're thinking, I ought to be able to come in and in this amount of weeks get all of these immediate sorts of results. And that's not how change happens. Real sustainable change. It doesn't happen that way. It happens through a billion tiny little changes that most of the time you don't see. And a lot of the time you'll feel like you failed at.
These small, imperceptible steps. It's fascinating. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to end with like a functional question of how people can get involved and keep up with what you're doing and things like that. But So do you think that it is appropriate or good for pastors or people that have public influence, things like that, to give, like, let's say something like immigration and something like gun control, to give all like several different like options of how people have come down to these decisions, to let people guide? Do you think we should avoid those things? Do you think we should say what we think and then present other options? Or like, because I know certain people would think, oh, well, that's not really guiding people in the truth. You're leading them astray. You're supposed to be their shepherd. You're supposed to be their shepherd and lead them. But I don't know what to do in some of these scenarios, because sometimes I feel like, I don't even know if I know what I think about this.
Yeah.
But I know it's a big issue, and we gotta talk about it and figure it out. What advice do you have along those lines?
Well, I mean, think about what Jesus is doing so often in teaching, and what, say, the prophet Nathan is doing in teaching King David, which is
Yes.
not to come in and directly say, you are in violation of Exodus 20 with Bathsheba, because he knows what the response is going to be to that self-protective mechanism. He comes around the side and talks about a man who's stolen somebody with less power's lamb, and gives he puts David in that place to see that, and then to be able to say, okay, this is the situation we're in right now. Jesus does that 1,000 times, in the Gospels. And sometimes what you're going to have to do is, again, to address what has immediately happened, that you have to address that. So September 11th happens, and you've got to address it the next Sunday. But usually what you're doing is, I found that if you can speak to people on something that they haven't already put their guards up around, and then and show them where they are there and where they're right there, and then to build out from that, then I think that's often more effective. So, for instance, if I'm dealing with in the public policy space, if I'm dealing with religious liberty, if I'm coming into an older conservative Christian audience, I'm going to start with them thinking about what it would be for the government to dictate what the Christian faith should be, and then say, and this, okay, you agree on that. That also applies to the rest of your neighbors, because that's not the way Christianity goes forward. If I'm talking to a progressive audience, I'm instead going to come in and first start with an example of a persecuted religious minority that's being overwhelmed by a majority, and say, okay, you see what you think about that, you're correct. That also applies to people that you think are the bad guys, religious,
right?
Or if I'm pro-life on abortion, I'm also pro-refugee, and what I'll often do is if you've got a community where refugees are coming in, the church needs to minister to them. I mean, I don't care what their position is on refugee policy. They have to minister to those people. In a lot of contexts, what I will do is to come in and start with the concern that they already have for the unborn and their mothers, and say, okay, why do you care about that? It's because you believe that people aren't worthy on the basis of how powerful they are, and you really do have a concern for vulnerability. This also applies to these people. If I'm in a place where they're all cool with doing refugee policy, but they think, well, I don't know how can you tell somebody what to do with their body? I had that situation not long ago where I said to this very progressive person, "Hey, I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I am asking you to see how somebody who thinks the way I do thinks. Take the the concept of the fetus or whatever you want to call this being, and just put in migrant child at the border." And then you might still not agree, but you'll at least know what it is, at least with good faith people, with what it is that you're arguing about. So I think that's a lot of it is helping people to see that they actually do already know how to do some of these things. They're just living in a kind of cognitive dissonance that they don't know how to fit all that together.
I love that. It's brilliant because like there's so often we are so good at compartmentalizing and being extremely logical and reasonable in this one area. Mm-hmm. And then in this other area, just throwing it out. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how we can do that. But if there's anything I know about people is they can believe two contradictory things at the same time, and they cannot even know that they're contradictory. They cannot even know because they haven't explored it. Go ahead.
And I think part of what you're trying to do when it comes to teaching them a way to think and to feel like a Christian is to realize what Jesus is doing. He doesn't come at the lawyer who's questioning him in Luke 10 with data. Samaritans are in the image of God, and you should treat Samaritans well. He doesn't do that. Instead, what does he do? He puts him into a story where this lawyer can actually see what is happening, and then to say which one of these is the neighbor to the other. So he's essentially, I mean, what Jesus is doing at a infinitely vaster scale is what C.S. Lewis said he was doing with the Narnia books, because he said you have a lot of people, they've become so familiar with the religion that they've sort of shut themselves off from it. And what I'm trying to do is to go around those watchful dragons so that I actually can have a conversation with somebody. And you can actually, if you, the kind of person who would, the minute that you say Jesus crucified, would say, not for me. If you put them in a situation where they see Aslan on the stone table, and then you come in and say, look at what this means in terms of Edmund, and how does that apply to you? Now let's talk about Jesus and the cross. I mean, what you're doing is helping them not to come in and somehow trick them. You're doing the opposite. What you're trying to do is to say, no, let's really have the conversation. And that also means being patient with people, because I mean, we don't change our minds usually by responding to data or to an argument. Usually things kind of sink into our minds and we mull them for a long time. And then something happens and we start to reconsider them. So I think that's we keep that in mind when we're talking to people, and don't just give up on one another.
I love that. I think that's so good. So Russell, thanks for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure. How can people keep up with your work, and what projects do you have coming up? And would you actually, would you give a little word on the after party and help people kind of understand what that's all about as well? Yeah,
they can follow us at christianitytoday.com, and it would be great to become a member and join with us there at CT. The after party is a curriculum that David French and Curtis Chang and I are working on, which is to help churches in a small group format, not with the what of politics. So it's not about here's what your view ought to be on whatever, immigration or gun control, but with the how of how to do that consistently with the gospel and with what it means to follow Christ. And so that's launching in January.
That's so cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us today, Russell. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you all. It's good to be with you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners and watchers, thank you for joining us. And we will see you next time. And until we see each other again, don't keep your conversations left or right, but up. All right, guys. God bless you. Have a great day.